Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Zoom event with Steven Ujifusa, author of Barons of the Sea and Their Race to Build the World's Fastest Clipper Ship. My name is Heidi Vaughn. I am the Executive Director of the Forbes House Museum, and I am delighted to have you here with us. There was a request to see me while I'm talking. So I'll go back to my video. There you go. So I'm so glad you're here with us tonight. Some of you are here by way of Milton Reads 2020. We were delighted to partner with the Milton Public Library on this initiative. It's a community-wide initiative bringing people together around a shared reading experience. And this year, the book chosen was Voyage of Mercy by author Stephen Puleo. What you see here is the USS Jamestown, so a sloop of war that became an angel of mercy. Captain Forbes was at the helm as he sailed it across the Atlantic Ocean in March to deliver humanitarian aid to the starving victims of the Irish famine. So some of you are coming with a solid knowledge of Robert Bennett Forbes at that time in his life. Tonight, we're going to hear more about the life and times in a broader perspective of Forbes and his contemporaries. Here's an image of the Forbes House Museum. This 1833 Greek Revival style mansion was built by brothers Robert Bennett and John Murray for their mother with money that they had earned in the China trade. The mansion sits atop a hill on Adams Street in Milton, Massachusetts. Across the street is the expansive Governor Hutchinson's Field. And beyond that, views of the Neponset River, which was once a busy waterway, delivering cargo and items to Milton and the surrounding areas, as well as Boston Harbor and the city skyline in the distance. Below that is our mission, which I'll read to you now. Inspired by the Forbes family legacy of entrepreneurship, social action, and philanthropy, the Forbes House Museum fosters discourse around civic engagement and cultural awareness. It's a great story that we tell at the Forbes House Museum. If you haven't visited, I hope you'll get a chance to when we reopen in the fall. The Forbeses, like many of the men that you read about in Barons of the Sea, were competitive businessmen, upstanding citizens, generous benefactors, and the stories of their involvement in the clipper ship industry and the development of America made for a very exciting read. Before I turn it over to Steven to tell us more about that, just some pointers about how the Zoom webinar will run tonight. You've probably realized you don't have audio or video controls, but we encourage you to communicate with the panelists via the Q&A feature. If you click on that icon, it will open up the box. You can type in your questions. And when Steve's done, probably 45 minutes or so into the hour, we'll be taking your questions. So now let me turn it over to Jeff Bernier, Chair of the Forbes House Museum Board of Trustees.
Thank you, Heidi. Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to you. Thank you for sharing part of your evening with us. We're delighted to have you. I am Jeff Bernier. I'm board chair of the Forbes House Museum, and along with, or on behalf of my fellow trustees and the staff at the Forbes House Museum, I'm really thrilled to welcome Steven Ujifusa, our guest speaker this evening. Steven Ujifusa is a resident of Philadelphia. He is a historian. He graduated from Harvard University with a degree in history and went on to pursue a master's in historical preservation at the University of Pennsylvania. His first book, A Man and His Ship, America's Greatest Naval Architect and His Quest to Build the SS United States, tells the story of William Francis Gibbs, who was the mastermind behind the creation of the SS United States, which was truly a marvel of American technology, built when really the United States was at the height of its manufacturing prowess. That book was named as one of the Wall Street Journal's top 10 nonfiction books of the year in 2012. His next book, and the subject of this evening's lecture, is Barons of the Sea and Their Race to Build the World's Fastest Clipper Ship. This book is full of marvelous insights into the glorious clipper ship of the 19th century and really vivid portrayals of some of America's earliest moguls and American family dynasties. Steve is a wonderful storyteller, and he really throws himself into his research, and we're in for a real treat. So it is my pleasure to introduce Steve Ujifusa. The floor is yours, Steve.
Jeff, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and Heidi, thank you so much for organizing this evening with the Forbes House Museum, which I've visited a few times in the course of my research and have made many trips to the Boston area to Baker Library and other resources for researching this book. And it's wonderful to be here virtually. And greetings from the city of Philadelphia. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, so welcome to everyone. And Barons of the Sea was a book that started off as one thing. It was about to be about the clipper ships. It started off as one thing, but ended up as something else. Originally, I was going to write a story, a biography about the great clipper ship designer, Donald McKay, who many of you are familiar with, the mastermind and naval architect of ships such as the Flying Cloud and the Westward Ho and the Sovereign of the Seas, and many of the great clippers that made, still are part of our popular culture in song and in lithographs and stories in the 1840s and 1850s, at a time when America's merchant marine was the finest in the world, and also very much figure in Bostonian history. John Murray Forbes was a part owner of a ship that McKay built called the Romance of the Seas. Robert Bennett Forbes was a good friend of Donald McKay and visited the shipyard in East Boston many times. But when I made the initial pitch to my editor and they accepted it, I had rather stupidly not done as much research as I should have because I love Donald McKay so much. And then I found out that a lot of his documents and papers have been destroyed in a flood in the 1920s. So I kind of had to go back to the drawing board with this book. And back in 2015, I was talking with a gentleman who you might know of in the maritime world, the recently deceased Llewellyn Howland III, who suggested to me that I write a book about the families associated with the clipper ship era, those that sponsored and financed their construction. And I thought about it, and then I was watching the PBS documentary on the Roosevelt family, and FDR's maternal grandfather came up, a gentleman named Warren Delano II, who was a native of the New Bedford area. And I thought about, wait a minute, Delano, he was a clipper ship owner, a partner in Russell and Company, which was the China trading firm that the Forbeses were involved in. And I'm like, wait a minute, these guys are fascinating. These guys that own these clippers and help sponsor their construction. Why don't I write a story about them? And it was then that Louis Howland told me, you're the person to write this book on these families. And as I've discovered in my research, as I basically had to reverse engineer this book, these were fascinating characters. They were part of a very small group of Yankee New Englanders, many of whom were related. Delano actually ended up marrying a cousin of John Murray Forbes. John Murray Forbes and Robert Bennett Forbes were, in fact, it was John Murray Forbes who introduced Warren Delano to his wife, Catherine. And I was thinking, wait a minute, this is the story of not just someone who influenced American business, but also someone who was the grandfather of a president and the father of probably the most famous or infamous tiger mother in American history, Sarah Delano Roosevelt. So I began digging into the Delano family history, and by extension, the Forbeses, and then the story came alive about how these clipper ships really came into construction. And they were built during a very specific, very short period of time between the 1840s and the mid-1850s when ships like this could be constructed. It was a very brief period. But here is an example of one of these marvelous vessels. This is the Sea Witch of 1846, owned by William Henry Aspinwall of the firm of Howland and Aspinwall in New York. Now, the Sea Witch, as you can see, is a lithe, sleek, extremely bare bones, minimalist creation. Form follows function is the mantra with these clipper ships. She was built to maximize speed at the sacrifice of cargo capacity, but the cargo that was being carried home from China to New York and to Boston was extremely valuable. This was tea, something that we take very much for granted today. We can buy it at Whole Foods whenever we want. But during the mid-19th century and the early 19th century, tea only came into the United States once a year, and the ship that brought the first pickings into New York or Boston or other East Coast ports, the ship that brought it in commanded the highest freight rates and gave the owners the greatest profits. The Sea Witch in 1847, set a record from Hong Kong to New York of 74 days with a cargo of tea. Now, in today's era of 14-hour flights to China and back, that doesn't sound at all impressive. But only a few years before, a pre-clipper type of American sailing ship carrying cargo of tea would take 120 to 180 days, sailing at only maybe 8 to 10 knots, something that Robert Bennett Forbes, who was a captain and master mariner by profession, noted. But clipper ships such as the Sea Witch cut down the sailing time to between 75 to 100 days. So this was a remarkable transformation. I mean, these guys that owned clipper ships like these were kind of the Jeff Bezos of their time. They rapidly sped up the global supply chain. And as you can see with this clipper ship, she has a sleek hull, sharp bow, sharp stern, and a huge expansive sail. Some of the biggest clipper ships had masts which reached over 200 feet in height. And truly, this was no holds barred American capitalism. No safety regulations. Many of these clipper ships were built and loaded up with cargo and sent off on their first voyage without any trial runs. Now, I've been asked many times, where does the term clipper ship come from? And the earliest reference I could find is from the poem by the English Restoration poet John Dryden, describing the flight of a falcon as she clips down the wind. And the definition of a clipper ship is a three-masted, full-rigged vessel that is a sailing vessel built first and foremost for speed over capacity. A lot of you might look at a three-masted ship today and say, oh, that's a clipper ship. No, 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 no. There are no surviving American clipper ships today. There are only two true clippers left in the world today, one of which is the Cutty Sark, which is a British example of 1869. The other is the Stad Amsterdam, which is a modern version of a clipper, a steel-hulled vessel built in the early 2000s. But a clipper ship is a very specific sort of vessel. Very expensive to operate because of all that sail area, and you have a very sharp hull, and you sacrifice cargo capacity for the sake of speed. Now, two of the characters, Delano and Barons of the Sea, both of them get their start in New Bedford in the early 19th century, and they sort of have these parallel lives. One of whom, on the left, is Warren Delano II, born in Fairhaven, Massachusetts in 1809, and then Moses Grinnell, born in New Bedford in 1810. Both of these men came from whaling families. Their fathers had made fortunes as captains of whaling vessels, but their fathers hoped to create a better life for their children. The whaling business, especially if you were a captain, was dirty, dangerous. You were away to 3 to 4 years at a time. So both of the fathers of Delano and Grinnell were looking for sort of upgrades for their sons' careers. And ultimately it proved very smart because whaling would eventually die out in the mid-19th century thanks to the discovery of petroleum in central Pennsylvania. So these two men, both as young men in their teens, they both ended up moving to New York City to start as clerks in commission houses on the South Street waterfront. And this is a time that even well-to-do children, such as Warren Delano and Moses Grinnell, they did not go to college. They, at around the age of 15 or 16, they would become apprentices at counting houses, either in New York or Boston. And they would learn double ledger accounting. They would learn how to load up a ship to sail off to China or to Liverpool, England. They learned basically the business from the ground up. And New York at this time was a very exciting place. This is where you could make money very quickly. This was a hurly-burly, rough and ready sort of place. There was very little separation between work and home. As you can see, the sailing ships went right up to where the counting houses were, and the townhouses of the successful merchants were only a few blocks away in modern-day Lafayette Place. So a very exciting place to be, and with the opening of the Erie Canal in 1826, New York City quickly surpassed Philadelphia and also Boston as the nation's preeminent port. So this was a place to go for opportunity. It was a time where there were all sorts of opportunities to make money in all sorts of technological ventures. The first locomotives, the first steam-powered locomotives began operating in the 1830s. This is something that the Forbes family would eventually get into in a big way after their investment in the clipper ships. You had yacht races, you had horse races up and down Broadway, and you also had the invention of the modern day, of the electric telegraph. So there were all sorts of opportunities to make money. And a lot of these men that made their fortunes in whaling began looking, this was sort of the oil money of its time, the energy boom. It was looking for things to invest in. Now, Moses Grinnell and Warren Delano took two very different paths that sort of reflect how to make a fortune in New York at the time, or Boston. Moses Grinnell decided to invest in a line of transatlantic sailing packets there were sailing ships that would leave on a regularly scheduled departures, not arrivals, because you couldn't have that in the age of sail, between New York and Liverpool and New York and London, carrying immigrants westbound and American raw goods, grain, and cotton on their eastbound trips. So Moses Grinnell ended up forming the famous firm of Grinnell, Minturn and Company, which became the preeminent operator of transatlantic packet ships between New York and Liverpool, and made Moses Grinnell an extremely rich man. But he didn't really travel all that much. He was known as what was called a sedentary merchant. Now, Warren Delano II, on the other hand, took the far riskier approach and the much more dangerous approach. And he decided to travel because of his hard work and skill and ability as a young businessman. In his early 20s, he was given the chance to sail off to the only port in China, the only city in China open to trade with the West, with America and Europe, and that was modern-day Guangzhou. He was with a small firm out of Boston, and his goal, as he hoped, was not just to make partner at his firm, but eventually become partner at a firm that the Forbes brothers had actually been involved with for a long time, and the greater Forbes family had been involved with for a long time, Russell and Company, which was the largest and most profitable of the several American firms doing business in Canton. Now, here's a picture of the so-called factory district in Canton Harbor. This was the only place in mainland China that was open to the Fangkuei, the foreign devils of the Chinese call the Westerners. This was a several square block compound on the waterfront where you had business people, all men. This is an all male compound. The women and children that did come were confined to the island of Macau, a Portuguese colony 80 miles downriver. Work hard, play hard environment. You had Scotsmen, Englishmen, Sephardic Jews from the Middle East. You had Yankees from New England. So this was a melting pot. And this was arguably one of the most exclusive trading clubs in the world. Now, Warren Delano II ultimately made partner his initial firm, and then was asked by the firm of Russell and Company to become partner. And he actually became very good friends with Robert Bennett Forbes, who was in China at the time after having lost his first fortune. And Robert Bennett Forbes liked Warren Delano very much, thought he was very able, and elevated Warren Delano to the partnership. So the Forbeses actually helped indirectly create the fortune that gave us FDR, but more on that later. This is the sort of vessel that firms like Russell and Company, and especially the British firms, used to carry tea from Canton to New York and Boston in the pre-clipper ship days. As you can see, this is a ship built for capacity over speed. These are known as East Indiaman, and for the British versions of these ships were often converted fourth-rate warships. And supposedly at night, the captains would furl up the sails because they were in no rush. The British trade was a government-sanctioned monopoly up until the mid-1830s. The Americans, on the other hand, the American government had no real interest in regulating or getting involved in any sort of government-sanctioned monopoly in the China trade. It just wasn't in their purview. The only thing they were interested in was collecting duties on the tea that was being imported into the United States. That was the main source of revenue for the United States at this time, in this era before income tax and business taxes. So customs duties were the main source of revenue. And as you can see, the underwater hull shape of the old-fashioned East Indiaman that belonged to the Americans and the British, the old saying was a codfish head and a mackerel tail, a blunt bow and a sharp stern, and heavy cargo capacity area. This is a theory of naval architecture that was built more on observation of fish by British naval designers in the 17th century than any sort of scientific fact. That was going to change by the 1840s with the rise of the American clipper ships. Now, if you were a partner of Russell and Company or a partner at any of the American firms, you wanted to become very, very good friends with this gentleman. This is the Chinese merchant Wu Ping-Chien, known by the Americans as Houqua. And he was the head of the 12 or so Chinese merchants who were allowed to do business with the Falcon. And Houqua commanded and owned some of those valuable tea plantations in China. And he was never really particularly enamored of the British merchants. He thought they were arrogant and thought they knew it all. And but he actually, when these Americans began arriving in the 1790s after the Revolution, and tea, as you know, helped spark the revolution in the 1770s. As soon as America gained its formal independence, they began sending merchants over to get our own share of tea. Houqua was very impressed with these Yankee merchants and decided that he could teach them and trust them. And among the first of these Yankee merchants was Thomas Handison Perkins, who was the uncle of the Forbes brothers, who started the firm Perkins and Company, and then was later folded into Russell and Company. So there was a multi-generational relationship with the Forbeses / Perkins and Houqua. And at the peak of his wealth in the 1830s, Houqua was worth an estimated $20 to $30 million. That's a lot of money in today's money, but multiply that for inflation, you're talking Jeff Bezos billions, one of the richest non-sovereigns in the world. So it was good to get to know this guy. And if you became one of his American sons, you were pretty well set up to do business with him, and you would get preferential treatment in shipping his best teas back home. And a lot of the British merchants lamented the fact that gentlemen such as the Forbes brothers and Warren Delano II had this preferential treatment by Houqua. In fact, John Murray Forbes, Robert Bennett Forbes' brother, had such a close relationship with Houqua as a young man that when he went back to Boston, he was entrusted with a decent-sized chunk, about $400,000 worth of Houqua's fortune, which he would eventually invest in enterprises such as early railroads, land in the Midwest, copper mines. This is arguably the first investment of Chinese venture capital in the United States. And J.M. Forbes and Houqua did have a special relationship, but he also particularly liked Robert Bennett Forbes and also liked Warren Delano II. And imagine if you were a kid from New Bedford or Boston, which was, compared to other world cities, was pretty provincial and small and dirty. And imagine you were invited to Houqua's palace on the Honam River, and you saw this. And this is when you knew you were in the club, when you were invited to one of Houqua's banquets. And a lot of these men looked at places like this, looked at Houqua's villa, and were like, oh my God, one day when I make my fortune and am able to come back to the United States, I want to build something like this. The goal of men such as Robert Bennett Forbes and Delano was to come back home with $100,000 to $200,000 in a fortune, so that would allow them to live independently, in an independently wealthy fashion, and also have money to invest in other enterprises. Not a lot of money today, it doesn't sound like, but back then that puts you well into the 1% of American society. There are some reports, though, of people who, young men who did not make partner at these firms, did not come home with their competences, and came home as failures. One person tried 3 times to become partner at Russell and Company, a gentleman named William Henry Lowe II. And even though his brother was partner, he never made it. And on the 3rd voyage home, he fell over the side of the ship that was bringing him home. And it's unclear whether he committed suicide or not, but I wouldn't be surprised if he felt a tremendous amount of failure. Now, the dark side to all of this wealth is that it was funded by opium. And this was something that Houqua really didn't, he said he was willing to shut his eyes to this, that a lot of his wealth came from this, but just like the British, the Americans did not produce a whole lot of things the Chinese wanted to buy in return for this highly coveted tea. So starting in the 1790s, the Americans began to do what the British had been doing since the 1760s, smuggling opium in from India. And the Perkins family also began smuggling opium in from Turkey. So this is a way to make up the trade deficit. Robert Bennett Forbes, as many of you know, in his reminiscences said he didn't see much difference between the marketing of opium and the marketing of strong spirits back in the United States. But the Chinese government did formally ban the importation of opium in 1799, but due to, it really wasn't enforced. There was just too much money changing hands. There was a system of bribery. And these are the ships that actually brought the opium into China illegally. These are the true ancestors of the Great American Clipper ships. This is a so-called Baltimore or opium clipper. It's a schooner-rigged vessel, sharp bow, sharp stern, high-rigged. These little schooners could hit 14 to 15 knots. And these are the ships that carried the opium in from China. And Russell and Company owned a fleet of these sorts of vessels. And they were meant not to evade just the Chinese coastal authorities, but also Malay pirates as they passed through the Straits of Malacca. And these ships would often drop anchor off of other ports in China that were not open to trade. There was also an opium store ship called the Linton, built in Boston, that was at the mouth of the Pearl River in Canton that Robert Bennett Forbes helped oversee the construction of. And it was controversial, but this was a sort of thing, I think, with these merchants who did their time in Canton. What happens in China stays in China. And I don't want to go into the whole rehash of the Opium Wars, but to give a quick overview, in the 1830s, the Chinese government decided to crack down on the smuggling and seized 20,000 chests of opium from American and British firms in Canton, and basically demanded that the opium trade be stopped. And this opium was thrown into the Pearl River. The British traders left in a huff, saying, "We'll be back with guns. How dare you destroy the Queen's opium?" The American firms, including Russell and Company, decided to stick around and carry out tea from an American ships, drop it off in the Dutch East Indies where British ships would pick it up and sail it back to London. And this allowed Robert Bennett Forbes, Warren Delano II, and also indirectly John Murray Forbes, to make one of the biggest killings in their entire career. John Murray Forbes would later say that in all of my investments, I have only not made much over 6%. This is one exception. And the Royal Navy eventually did come back to Canton and shelled the city of Canton, and as well as several other cities in the Chinese coastline. And the antique Chinese Navy made out of wood was no match for steam-powered vessels. So this was the beginning of what is known as the century of humiliation for China. With the conclusion of the Opium Wars in the early 1840s, China was forced to cede the island of Hong Kong as a crown colony to England, and was also forced to open several other ports, including Shanghai, to Western trade. Now, Robert Bennett Forbes and Warren Delano were there and present during this whole incident. They were actually locked up in the factories in Canton during the initial siege. So this is sort of a bonding experience for these guys. And Warren Delano II, after the defeat of the Chinese Navy, wrote back home saying, well, it's a shame that this has had to happen, but the British have taught the Chinese a much needed lesson because of their arrogance. And by the way, this is a very good time to consider building a new sort of vessel to capitalize on an expanded China trade. Warren Delano II was talking about building a bigger version of the Baltimore clipper, a square-rigged, three-masted version of the ship, which would eventually become the Great American Tea Clippers and later the California Clippers of the 1850s. Here is a prototype of this sort of vessel that Warren Delano had been talking about. This was arguably the earliest of the ancestor of the three-masted clippers. This is the Anne McKim of 1833, basically a three-masted Baltimore clipper, a ship that held the record for the fastest passage between Canton and New York, but she was too small and too sharp-hulled to make much money. So Warren Delano II and some others of his friends from Russell and Company, as well as other competing merchants in New York, decided to invest in larger versions of these ships that can carry much more tea home and make a lot more money. Here's an underwater hull model of the clipper ship Young America of 1853. As you can see, she is very different from the Codfish head, Mackerel tail, a sharp bow and a sharp stern and a V-shaped bottom for speed, and she's also pretty large. And there were a number of naval architects in New York City and also in Boston that have been tinkering with this idea for a long time. And the Opium Wars, which had given the British Hong Kong and opened up several other ports to Western trade, allowed these naval theorists, such as John Willis Griffiths, to put their ideas into practice. Here's the clipper ship Sea Witch of 1846. The following year, or 2 years later, John Willis Griffiths would build a sister ship for her of the Sea Witch called the Memnon, built expressly for Warren Delano II. And Willis Griffiths' idea of a clipper ship was to have a sharp bow, a sharp stern, and a V-shaped bottom for maximum speed. And his ships were extremely effective. The Sea Witch was, by modern standards, a fairly small vessel, only around 200 feet in length, but she was able to make a lot of money for her owners, Howland and Aspinwall in New York. And another naval theorist was Captain Nathaniel Brown Palmer, who did work for the Low family of New York City. The Lows were also partners at Russell and Company, and Delano and Forbes were close with Abiel Abbott Low, the main partner in the shipping firm of A.A. Low and Company, which was founded after he came back from Canton. Captain Palmer's idea was, why not have a sharp bow, a sharp stern, and a flat bottom so you maximize cargo capacity for all those tests. My favorite characters who I researched in Barons of the Sea was Abiel Abbott Low's brother, Charles Porter Low, who decided he did not want to become a proper China merchant like his brothers. He wanted to become a sea captain. He tried to run away to sea as a young child many times, and eventually he was given the chance to to go to sea in his teens, and he eventually rose to become captain of some of the great clipper ships owned by his family. And he wrote a series of memoirs that is truly fun reading and really allowed me to recreate what it was like, a captain's perspective from what it was like being on a clipper ship in the China route and later the California route. Now, the Low family's most famous clipper ship was the Oriental of 1848. This is the first American clipper ship to sail on the China route from Hong Kong to London. British merchants were so frustrated at the slowness of their ships that they petitioned Parliament to lift the Navigation Acts and allow them to carry tea on consignment on these American ships. And this ship arrived from Hong Kong to London in the record-breaking time of 97 days. The reaction of the Times of London was, how dare they? Who do these people think they are? And we must run a race with our great unshackled rival, they said. And before the Oriental sailed home for New York, she was put in a dry dock to clean off her bottom. And some British naval architects decided to take a look at it. And they said, hey, can we take the lines off this ship and see, we just want to get some ideas. And the Low family were like, yeah, sure, take a look. And within a year or so, I don't want to say knockoffs. Well, they were kind of British knockoffs began arriving on the scene. And a number of Boston and New York merchants decided to form a syndicate and including Warren Dell II and the Forbeses, to challenge the British clippers to a race from Hong Kong to London, run along regatta regulations, yacht club regulations with a 10,000-pound purse put up by Baring Brothers of London, an investment firm that the American traders and Forbes, especially the Forbeses, had a close relationship with. But the British never took them up on this offer. Now, the event that really threw fuel on the fire and accelerated the building of bigger and faster clipper ships was the discovery of gold in California in 1848, and turned the clipper ship business from not just a China-America thing, but around the world journey that for a few years led to tremendous profits. And when gold was discovered in California, pretty much everyone who was able to, drop what they were doing on the East Coast and tried to find a way either overland or over the Panama Isthmus or around Cape Horn to get to San Francisco, which at the time was only a village of 2,000 people in the recently conquered California territory, conquered from Mexico during the Mexican War. And it was one of the largest human migrations of that era. And most people who came to California either went overland or they took steamships that sailed from New York to one side of the Panama Isthmus. They would travel overland by mule, and then they catch another steamship that would take them to San Francisco. That was good for passengers and mail. But for heavy freight, for bulk cargo, that was not an option, either going overland or going over the Isthmus, which was, although it was 40 miles, it was just too arduous. So the best way to ship all the goods needed to build a great city was by sailing vessel around Cape Horn, 10,000 miles, the most dangerous sea route on the face of the globe. And this is where Warren Dell II had a stroke of genius and decided to redeploy his clipper ship, the Memnon, from the China route to the San Francisco route. And she sailed from New York to San Francisco in 120 days, when the typical converted whaler or old transatlantic packet ship would take 160 to 180 days. Now, if you're carrying a cargo of dry goods, provisions, liquor, plate glass, chairs, tables, manufactured out east, the faster you got those goods to San Francisco, the better. San Francisco in the late 1840s, 1850s was a place where an egg cost $1. One 1850s dollar. You're talking about a $20 egg. Boots sold for $60. And the old saying is, in order to make money during a gold rush, you don't dig for gold, you try to sell stuff to the gold miners. So many other people began piling on to this and began building bigger and faster clipper ships to carry freight, occasionally passengers, but mostly freight to San Francisco. And traveling on a clipper ship, if you're a crew member or a passenger, it was not a fun experience. If you're one of the 20 or so passengers traveling a clipper ship, this was an all first class experience. It was a very expensive way to go. You would have, there'd be a floating barnyard on board for fresh meat. There'd be fresh eggs. You'd have you'd had canned vegetables. It was not a bad way for passengers. It wasn't a bad way to go. You'd live in pretty comfortable quarters with the officers. But if you were one of the 60 or so crew members on a California clipper ship, you're talking about a hellish passage around Cape Horn. And this was no holds barred, laissez-faire capitalism, no safety regulations whatsoever. Supposedly on the watch system was 4 hours on, 4 hours off with 2-hour dog watches to even out the day. But not in the case of the California clippers, where time was money and speed was everything. When you climbed up a loft during a gale, you didn't clip in up there. When you were swinging in a huge arc, 10 to 15 stories above the ocean, and if you fell overboard, you think the captain of that clipper ship's going to turn around and get you? You can't stop a sailing ship. And there was no way of communication with the land. There was no ship-to-shore wireless would not be invented until 1900. So you were out on your own, isolated from the outside world, and imagine the chance of disappearing without a trace. That occasionally happened with these clipper ships, and people wouldn't know what happened to you. And there were also cases of if they couldn't get enough crew members to book on these clipper ships, you would they would often the captain would often engage agents known as crimps who would drop a bit of opium or some sort of drug into the drinks of men at the bordellos or saloons along South Street, and they'd wake up on a clipper ship bound for California with a third of their wages taken by the agents. So nasty work on these clipper ships. And it was a race. These clipper ships occasionally came inside of each other and would race each other at speeds from anywhere from 15 to 20 knots. One clipper ship, the Sovereign of the Seas, reportedly made 22 knots for a very short period in the Pacific Ocean. Now, to give you some perspective, 22 knots is a pretty good turn of speed. That's about 25 land miles per hour. This was the fastest of any commercial vessel. A typical paddle wheel steamship could only do about 10 to 12 knots tops. And 22 knots is about the service speed of the RMS Titanic, built in 1912. So this is truly extraordinary for a ship made entirely out of wood and canvas. Now, ships made of wood and canvas, they are much more fragile than today's vessels of steel and iron. And these clipper ships often did carry full spreads of sail in gale conditions so they can get to California as quickly as possible. And sometimes they were dismasted, sometimes they were swamped. The clipper ship Houqua, named after the great merchant, was dismasted and almost capsized off Indonesia with Captain Charles Porter Lowe in command. And something I talk about in Barons of the Sea. So there are many, many close calls on these voyages. And one of the great problems going around Cape Horn is that you're almost always encountering westerly winds blowing you back and back. It's very hard to sail into the wind in a square rig vessel. So sometimes these vessels would go all the way down to Antarctica, try to sail back up and avoid these prevailing westerlies. And imagine trying to steer a clipper ship with no auxiliary power whatsoever through an ice field. One clipper ship, the Wild Pigeon, was actually struck an iceberg and sank. Thankfully, another vessel was nearby and all hands were saved, but it was a very dangerous business. But these clipper ships would sail from New York to San Francisco, sell their goods of Eastern manufactured commodities, and there's a lot of booze on board these ships too. And they would sail on to Canton or Hong Kong, drop off whatever cargo they were carrying, and then pick up the tea and then sail around the Cape of Good Hope back home. So it was a round the world voyage, and this is what made the Forbeses and the Lows and the Delanos very rich during this brief period of time. John Murray Forbes would later say that the stress of loading up a California clipper, filling up every conceivable nook and cranny with goods, gave him such stress that he would have a so-called box fever, where he would have to retire to his island of retreat of Nau Shan with leeches on his forehead. He was definitely a workaholic. Now, returning to Donald McKay, who I mentioned earlier, this man was the master of the so-called California clipper. He was the one that built the big 200, 300-foot flat-bottom clippers for the California trade that set more records than any other shipbuilder. And he became close friends with the Forbeses, and he was kind of one of Boston's great folk heroes. His shipyard in East Boston for a time was one of the biggest and most successful in the United States, and he churned out transatlantic packets. He also turned out the finest clipper ships in the world. And he was actually an immigrant success story. He was originally from Nova Scotia, and he immigrated to America as a young boy, as a teenager, to apprentice himself to a New York shipbuilder. His father basically signed away his parental rights to the master shipbuilder in exchange for the shipbuilder to teach the young boy all the art and mystery of shipbuilding. And Donald McKay would later describe the whole process as slave-ocratic. But eventually he would migrate to Newburyport and eventually to Boston, where he would build his own shipyard, largely due to the financing of the Boston packet merchant Enoch Train. And I love these two quotes of Donald McKay. Kind of sums up who he is. He was someone who for a brief period became pretty successful, made a very good amount of money as a shipbuilder, but he never bought a mansion on Beacon Hill. His house was close to a shipyard in East Boston. He entertained many of the leading politicians of his day, including Daniel Webster. The poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was a close friend of his. In fact, Longfellow dedicated the poem, The Building of a Ship, to his good friend Donald McKay. Delano, great ship of state. His second wife, Mary McKay, came up with many of the great names for his clipper ships, including Sovereign of the Seas, Flying Cloud, and so she had a great gift for words as well. So for a brief period, he was kind of this Jacksonian, self-made shipbuilding hero. He supposedly would get up in the middle of the night and walk down from his mansion in Eagle Hill and inspect the hulls of the ships under construction. And although he was the owner of the yard, he had no problem working alongside his men. So he was someone who had great faith in the promise of this country. And this is what the shipyard looked like at its peak. During this era of the boom years of the California and China clipper ship trade, these ships were built within 3 to 6 month spans, and almost entirely out of wood except for the metal bolts that held them together, the iron bolts. And it took a tremendous amount of mastery to know which sort of wood went where. Rock maple was used for the keels of these vessels, the most rot and saltwater resistant of woods, and white oak was used for the hulls, the hull planking and the ribs of the ship. The decks were made of pine, and the interiors were finished with rosewood and other fancy wood. So this was a real art form. These ships were launched. When these ships were launched in Boston, the city would often close down. People would leave their offices and warehouses to watch these ceremonies. The ships were christened with champagne, although occasionally they were christened with water, depending on the if there were temperance activists who were involved. Believe it or not, this did happen. But these were big celebrations, and Donald McKay liked being the master of these ceremonies. He built ships for Bostonians, including the Romance of the Seas for John Murray Forbes, and he also built a lot of ships for New Yorkers, including the Grinnell family, Moses Grinnell, who I mentioned earlier. He began hiring McKay to build transatlantic packet ships, and then he began eyeing the possibility of getting into the China trade, into the California and China trade himself. He had never really had much of a presence in this. He had never spent time in China. He had never known Houqua, so a lot of the Russell and Company guys, like the Forbeses and Delanos, saw him as kind of an interloper who was trying to buy his way into their club. But he decided to make an offer on a clipper ship called the Flying Cloud, which was under construction for Enoch Train. And he put in a bid of $90,000 for this vessel, which he bought unfinished. And Enoch Train would later say that was the biggest financial mistake he ever made, because the Flying Cloud would make a very good name and a lot of money for Moses Grinnell and his partner, Robert Bound Minturn of Grinnell, Minturn and Company. Now, in 1851, the Flying Cloud set off on her maiden voyage from New York to California, carrying hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of goods. She was the first clipper ship command of Josiah Perkins Creasy of Marblehead, Massachusetts. And Creasy had a secret weapon. He had his wife come along with him on board. It was not uncommon for spouses to come along with captains on these voyages. But Eleanor Perkins Creasy was unique in that she actually was his navigator. He listened to her directions on trips. And she was a brilliant mathematician. She also carried a copy of a new set of winds and currents charts of Lieutenant Matthew Fontaine Maury, which allowed the Flying Cloud to sail from New York to San Francisco in the record-breaking time of 89 days, 21 hours. And then a few years later, she broke that record, 89 days, 8 hours. That record stood under sail until 1989. So something to consider. This is a real accomplishment. Consider that these captains and their navigators used only the stars and the sun to navigate, and truly an amazing accomplishment. And Donald McKay decided bigger was better. The next major clipper he built was the Sovereign of the Seas, and no merchant would buy her. She was so large at over 2,500 tons and over 300 feet in length. Eventually, he decided to operate her himself, and he sold her for a tremendous profit. And then he decided to invest in this thing, which was the Great Republic. This ship was about 350 feet in length, 4,500 registered tons, 4 masts, not 3. She was a 4-masted clipper bark. Her main yard stretched 110 feet in width, and no one would buy this ship. Captain Robert Bennett Forbes, however, was fascinated with this vessel. I mean, he was someone who, at heart, was much more of a master mariner and a sort of amateur naval architect than a merchant, really. And in fact, his new rig was used in the Great Republic, something that I can go on to more later. But he eventually, Captain Forbes invented a new rig, the Forbes rig, which split the topsail in half, making it easier to handle in bad weather. And the Great Republic was launched to great ceremony in the fall of 1853. Robert Bennett Forbes was there in attendance. But there were people that were skeptical of this vessel, saying that there's one person said there's no ocean too big enough to sail this monster. She won't make any money, and she is towed down to New York to be loaded with cargo for Liverpool. They're going to try to sail her to Liverpool. They're going to load her up with grain. And unfortunately, a fire breaks out at a nearby bakery and spreads to the South Street waterfront to Peckslip, where the Great Republic is moored, and she burns to the waterline and sinks. This devastates Donald McKay, who receives hourly telegraph updates in the middle of the night to his house in East Boston. And this really broke his heart. Not only that, she had cost $320,000 to build, which was basically all of Donald McKay's net worth. And she was only insured for about $200,000. The wreck is eventually salvaged, and the Lowe brothers eventually buy her and build her into a much smaller vessel. But the tragedy, one of the great tragedies of American maritime history, is no one ever knew how fast the Great Republic would have gone under full sail. She probably would have exceeded 22, 23 knots in best conditions. But by the mid-1850s, the clipper ship trade began to wane because California began to develop its own infrastructure, manufacturing, agriculture. So freight rates began to drop precipitously. So you did have some merchants like William Fletcher Weld of Boston began investing in what are known as medium clippers. These are vessels that are less sharply hulled, much less expensive to operate, much less heavily rigged. They could be manned by about half the crew, and they would take maybe 120 to 130 days to make it to California. So they still made money, and they just weren't as costly to run. So a lot of these extreme clippers, these early ones, began to lose value sharply. And those merchants that were able to sell them quickly enough began investing their proceeds in other sorts of ventures, such as railroads. John Murray Forbes began doing that, as did R.B. Forbes, and Delano began investing in coal and New York real estate. And these are the houses they began building to reflect their new fortunes. The house on the left is the Nathaniel Brown Palmer House in Stonington, Connecticut. The house on the right, we all know, is the Captain Robert Bennett Forbes house in Milton, Massachusetts, with its Chinese-themed parlor. Many of these houses were stuffed to the gills full of Chinese memorabilia. And if you were in the club and if you were part of the in crowd, you had a portrait of Houqua above your fireplace. The grandest of all of these homes, arguably, was the Algonac Mansion in Newburgh, New York, in the Hudson Valley, built by Warren Delano II as his dream palace, his Italianate stuccoed version of Houqua's palace on the Honam River. I'm pretty sure he had this in mind. And the house was, like the R.B. Forbes house, filled with Chinese goods. A gong summoned the family down to dinner. That's what Sarah Delano, the young Sarah Delano, remembered of this house. And this house became the refuge for the Delano family. They thought they were secure. They thought that they had made their fortune in clipper ships and the China trade and in coal and other ventures. And they prepared to settle in for a serene existence as kind of Hudson Valley patricians. and Catherine Delano, who was a cousin of the Forbes, she was introduced by John Murray Forbes to Warren Delano II, and she had a large family, and they were all settled in. They thought they were set, but then in 1857, the economy crashed due to overspeculation in Western lands and railroads. Warren Delano II was left almost bankrupt in this situation and faced almost certain ruin at the age of 50. And however, his Canton brethren, as they were known, decided to help him out. And he was allowed to go back to Hong Kong as a partner at Russell and Company and resume business in the opium and tea trade to rebuild his fortune as quickly as possible. So in 1859, he set sail back for Hong Kong, leaving his family behind, 8 children, including one of whom was born after he left. This daughter was known as the posthumous child by little Sarah Delano, who would, when the letters began arriving back home from Hong Kong, everyone knew that he was safe, and she would steam the stamps off the letters and put them in an album. She dearly missed her beloved papa, who she felt there was no one like. He was the patriarch. He was this commanding figure, well over 6 feet tall, who ran his family with an almost autocratic sense of order. But this threw the whole Delano family dynamic into disorder. And so he was sent back to become a partner of Russell and Company. And then in 1862, his former business partner, Abiel Abbott Lowe, decided to lease out Algonac to save it for the Delanos, and then the Delanos set sail on the clipper ship Surprise to Hong Kong to join beloved Papa. And Sarah Delano remembered as a child hearing the sea shanties sung by the sailors as they worked the ship. And she and her brother, Philippe, remember the sailmaker, repairing the sails and piercing his finger with needles because one of the thumbs had become paralyzed. So this is some of her earliest memories as a child. The Surprise arrived in Hong Kong after a very dismal passage of 128 days. Very bad passage for a clipper ship, but the Delano family arrived safe. They remained there for several years. And there's an incident which I'll talk about in the Barons of the Sea, which I'll save for you to read, in which Warren Delano II tries to pull a bit of financial trickery on his old friend, John Murray Forbes. To learn more about this attempted double-crossing, read Barons of the Sea. But Warren Delano II was someone who liked to say, "I never let my right hand what my left hand is doing," and his first desire was to make sure that his family's fortune was secure. He returned to the United States in 1869 as a rich man. Now, the end of the clipper ship era, there's a misconception that, steamships came along in the 1850s and that was the end of the clipper ship. Not true. On the high seas, steam and sail coexisted between the 1840s and the 1860s. The Cunard Line operated a passenger and mail transatlantic service between Liverpool and Boston and Liverpool and New York. And these paddle wheel steamers could travel around 8 to 10 knots with help from some sails. And they really weren't good for carrying cargo because their engines and their coal took up way too much space to make them profitable. But by the 1870s, iron-hulled vessels were big enough to carry both enough coal, powerful engines, and enough cargo to make them profitable in the China trade. The Transcontinental Railroad in the late 1860s allowed freight to be carried seamlessly between the East Coast and the West Coast. And then the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 also allowed steamships to make quicker passages and dooming the clipper ships to oblivion. And the Civil War also did a number on the American merchant marine. Confederate commerce raiders, largely built in England, to sink the Yankee ships were dispatched to chase after. They mostly captured whalers, some cargo vessels, but a few clipper ships, despite their speed, were caught by these by these Confederate commerce raiders. Here is an engraving of the clipper ship Jacob Bell being burned by the steam-powered Confederate raider CSS Florida in 1863 in the Indian Ocean. She was carrying a cargo of about $200,000 worth of tea, and she almost outsailed the Florida until the winds died. and the tea and all those valuable cargo was taken on board by the Florida, because the good folks in Richmond and Charleston missed their tea too. And the passengers and crew were also taken prisoner, and then the Jacob Bell was set on fire. So a number of clipper ships were destroyed too, and this really shot up insurance rates. So by the end of the war, most of the extreme clipper ships of the California and China trade were gone, and those families that had gotten out in time had already invested in railroads and coal mining and copper mining and Western lands. And in fact, John Murray Forbes continued to invest that chunk of Houqua's money until the 1870s, returning a very handsome profit in return. Eventually, Houqua's family got their principal back, but those that were smart investors rolled over these fortunes into ventured into the post-Civil War industrial era. Winners and losers. Donald McKay was a loser. He sadly went bankrupt in the 1870s. He really was only good at building wooden ships, and by the 1870s, iron had come into play, and he died largely broke on a farm in Hamilton, Massachusetts. And don't be betrayed by the size of the house. He had to write for a number of his many sons, I cannot give them any more because I've already given them what is just. But it is memorialized in the city of Boston and the surrounding area with statues. And here's a stained glass window at Tabor Academy. And he really was an artist. He really, although he is not the most effective businessman, his record stands as being arguably the greatest clipper ship designer in American history. And he's still remembered as such. Winners for the Forbeses and the Delanos and the Lows. If that name Lowe's sounds familiar, those of you that know Columbia University, their main library was named after the Low family. It was in fact Low family money that helped finance the construction of that entire campus up in Morningside Heights. The Forbeses, invested in became involved with the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, and also eventually by the second generation, John Murray Forbes' son, William Hathaway Forbes, invested in a small communication venture that became known as Bell Telephone and later AT&T. And then Warren Delano II, he became heavily involved in coal mines in Maryland and Pennsylvania. They returned to Algonac, and the Algonac estate remained the family homestead until the 1940s. In fact, Algonac became a code word in the Delano family for all is well if they were undertaking a dangerous trip. And here's Warren Delano II shown at the family compound in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, surrounded by all of his grandchildren. Guess who's at the very top? That is the young Franklin Delano Roosevelt, probably recently returned from Groton School, where in fact he had a pretty miserable high school experience. But he worshipped his grandfather Delano. And his mother, Sarah, would eventually say, oh, Franklin might have the Roosevelt last name, but he's all me. He is all Delano. And the grandchildren, I'm sure, asked Warren Delano, Grandpa, tell us about your time in China. Tell us about your adventures. And he didn't really want to talk about it. Captain Robert Bennett Forbes wrote all the former Russell partners saying, hey, we should have a company history of Russell and Company and talk about all our adventures. Warren Delano II wrote a very bland one-page response. John Murray Forbes was not particularly happy with this at all. Basically, in so many words, he said, my brother Bennett has always talked too much. And Robert Bennett Forbes wrote his own reminiscences anyway. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. They're wonderfully colorful, funny, but also very revealing memoirs about the China trade, the clipper ship era. And if you haven't read them, I highly recommend them. They were an invaluable resource for barons of the sea. And, once again, these clipper ship fortunes, including the Delano one, made possible one of our most consequential and influential presidents, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt inherited his love of the sea from his Delano family, and he would build models of ships himself, including a model of the clipper ship Surprise, which stood in the Oval Office during his presidency. And he liked to quote his grandfather Delano about how he succeeded in politics. And he said, "I never let my right hand know what my left hand is doing." And he inherited a certain caginess and also, I think, a certain amount of ruthlessness from his Delano family. He felt, as historian Jeffrey Ward said, that his rightful position was at the center of the world, whether it was at Hyde Park or in the Oval Office as the most powerful man in the United States. But also his ability to remain calm and cheerful in the face of tremendous personal and national trials. I think you could say that a lot of that came from the Delano family ethos of, even when you're under tremendous stress, you don't betray bad feelings, you don't let yourself get flustered. I think that's the sort of mindset it took to survive, to be a merchant in the Delano Forbes mindset or model. And in conclusion, I would like to I'm very grateful to the descendants of many of the barons of the seas who provided their time, their archives, their photographs, and knowledge to help me write this book. And I owe a particular debt of gratitude to the recently deceased Louis Howland, who was a Yankee book editor of the old school, who graduated from Harvard in '59, and he was the one that told me I was the one to write this book on their families. The descendants of the Delano, of Warren Delano II, have also been extraordinarily helpful. In fact, Sarah Delano Perkins let me use a few photographs of unpublished photographs in Barons of the Sea that were sitting in the Delano Perkins family house in Milton, Massachusetts. So a special thanks to them. And in closing, I'd like to borrow a page from my wife's profession, where they end medical presentations with pictures of their children. Here are two future sailors, my sons Isaac and Max. And I will say that in my research of the Barons of the Sea and studying these old Yankee families, a lot of Old Testament names, a lot of Isaacs, Ezekiel's, Jabez's, you name it. So once again, thank you so much to the Forbes House Museum, to Jeff Bernier, to Heidi Vaughn. It's been an honor to speak to all of you, and I'm here to entertain any questions.
Thank you, Steve. That was wonderful. The depth of your knowledge on so many fronts was really amazing. And what a heartbreaking story about the Great Republic being burned before it ever got to set sail. You actually had some experience in researching this on one of the two clipper ships you mentioned, didn't you?
Well, I did get to visit the the Stad Amsterdam when she visited New York City, but I also had the great fortune of being a guest twice on board the clipper schooner Shenandoah off Martha's Vineyard, where I was a guest of a woman by the name of Stephanie Speakman, who charters the Shenandoah every summer for a trip, and that was extraordinary to be sailing off Martha's Vineyard and also off Nashan Island on this vessel which was built in the spirit of the 1850s. She was a schooner, not a full rig vessel, but with basically no auxiliary power, no electricity. So you really got a sense of what it was like to be on a ship of that vintage. Truly, truly incredible.
I would love that. I bet a lot of us would. That's amazing. We have a few questions here. One is, what about other countries who are building clippers? We heard a lot about England and America. Could you talk about any of the other countries?
That's a very good question. They're actually, clipper ships weren't exactly, during this era, they were pretty much an English and American thing. I think there were a few Dutch-built clippers, but they were not, it was pretty much an American and English thing. Why, I don't know, but I'm sure that design ideas filtered back to France and filtered to the Netherlands, but extreme clippers weren't really, well built, exactly, in the mid-19th century type, weren't exactly common. Although I will, by the late 19th century, the Germans really took up the sailing ship mantle with the construction of these steel-hulled windjammers, such as the Peking, which is recently part of New York. So you had a line of steel-hulled, very fast sailing ships called from the Flying P line, which carried nitrates from Chile to Hamburg. And the Leitz family was very prominently involved in that. So the Germans, I think, were actually kind of the heirs to that tradition, but they came later and they built their ships out of steel.
Interesting. Okay. So this comes from a friend in Istanbul who woke up quite early to join us. Is the standing portrait of Catherine Delano by George Chinnery or Lambqua? Are you familiar with that?
I know there's a captain of, did you say Joseph Delano or Clement Delano?
Catherine Delano.
Oh, Catherine Delano. Yeah, I've heard of it, but I don't think that was, I'm not sure if that was the one by Chinnery. I'm not sure, the one that I showed. But yeah, Chinnery, I wouldn't be surprised because she went to China right after she married Warren Delano II in, I believe, 1844. She, as soon as they got married, he said, I'm going back to China to make more money. So she was like, oh my God, what do I do? I just married this guy and now I have to go to a place I'd never, she was like 18 at the time. So she took up residence in Macau. So I haven't, you know, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I'm sure that was painted when she was living in Macau while Warren Delano, or Hong Kong. Sorry, I take that back. When she was living in Hong Kong. So.
And I can understand the confusion. Lambqua, as I understand it, studied with Chinnery and so learned the Western style of portraiture.
Yeah, I really don't know. Yeah, I don't know whether it was by Chinnery or Lambqua. I really don't. So.
Okay. Could you speak to the difference between clipper ships and packet ships?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Packet ships were built for the transatlantic trade generally, but they were also built for trade between New York and New Orleans. And these ships were built to operate on a schedule. And the transatlantic packet ships were meant to carry passengers and mail. They often had pretty luxurious passenger quarters, at least in the first class areas. And they would also carry cargo, but they had regularly scheduled departures, not regularly scheduled arrivals, because in the age of sail, you never knew whether it would take 2 weeks or 3 months to sail across the Atlantic. But the packet ships that were owned by the Swallowtail Line, which was the trade name for Grinnell, Minturn and Company, or the Black X Line, which was the Griswold line. These were ships that departed once every week or every 2 weeks from New York City to Liverpool. The Black Ball Line actually inaugurated the concept of regularly scheduled departures in 1817. It seems so basic to us today, but before then, a packet ship a typical ship on the way to England they wouldn't sail until their holds were loaded. So if you were a passenger and you wanted to book passage, you'd basically be waiting around for weeks until the ship was full. But the Black Ball Line and later the Black X Line and the Swallowtail Line, they eventually said the ship will sail on this date, full or not full. So that made the cargo operators have to conform to their schedule. And the passengers are like, great, we know exactly when to book passage. Clipper ships were actually kind of a fancy version of tramp steamers or tramp ships. They sailed wherever the cargo took them or wherever was most profitable. So although they were the aristocrats of the seas, by modern day definition, they would be kind of tramp steamers. They had no regularly scheduled departures. They would be deployed on whatever was most profitable at the moment.
Thank you. Okay, how were shipbuilding secrets safeguarded? Was there patent protection and IP theft?
Oh, that's a very good question. Actually, in those days, not really. The half-hull models were on display, and shipyard workers talked amongst themselves. The real, I guess you could say the real secrets when it came to shipbuilding was becoming a master shipbuilder. The only way you could do that was to apprentice yourself at age 13 or 14 to a master shipwright in New York or Boston. And only then could you graduate your apprenticeship and be trusted as someone, as a member of the guild who could actually build ships. This is something that took so much skill and so much hard work that it was kind of a trade secret. In fact, the phrase art and mystery was used. You know, which woods went where, how to use certain tools. It was a very arcane, specialized skill. So, you know, trade secrets when it came to hull design or whatnot, these are transmitted all over the place. But the actual craft of building them, that was a tight secret. You couldn't just jump in and say, hey, I want to start a shipyard. Not going to happen.
Okay, going back a bit, who built the Empress of China, the first American ship to go to Canton? Was it Thomas Peck? Was he related to Thomas Handyside Peck? I mean Perkins in that case. Was it Thomas Handyside Perkins?
I don't know if he was related to Thomas. I wouldn't be surprised, but I can't answer that question directly, but I will say that the more I've studied this, it doesn't surprise me that all these guys are related somehow. But Thomas Handyside Perkins, it's interesting. He sort of ran this kind of family operation, and where he was one of the first American traders actually in China after the revolution, after independence. He started that friendship with Houqua, and then his idea was kind of like, I'm going to take all my cousins, nephews, I'm going to give them the chance to go to China and make their fortune, so they will become independently wealthy. They won't have to rely on me. But the Forbes/Perkins family retained very tight control over Russell and Company, and they're very loath to let insiders in. In fact, that's what makes Warren Delano kind of an outlier, because he was not related to the Forbeses or the Perkinses, and the fact that they let him in says something, that he must have been extremely able and made a very good impression on Robert Bennett Forbes.
So that was actually news to me. There is a Thomas Handyside Peck and also a Thomas Handyside Perkins. Are those two different characters?
As far as I know, they are. I mean, there's.
Okay.
But I'm not aware of. Yeah, I don't know what the connection is, but Handyside is an unusual name, so.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I shared that question correctly. What first sparked your interest in learning more about the clipper ship era? And well, let's start with that. What first sparked your interest?
Well, it sort of grew out of my first book on the SS United States, which was about a fast ocean liner, kind of like the SS United States was a bit like a clipper ship in that she was the culmination of a certain form of vessel, the transatlantic passenger liner, which had been in development for a century, a steam-powered ship. But at the same time, they were the culmination of a sort of technology. They were both out of date by the time they arrived on the scene. They had a very short sort of heyday. And it grew out of actually my interest in the SS United States, where I'm like, well, I've always loved sailing ships. I was always attracted to their, the clipper ship's beauty and form. But then I began looking at the underwater hull of the SS United States and saw a lot of similarities. I'm thinking, well, let's go back to an era when America really was, it was sort of at this crossroads where we could either become a nation that sort of looked into itself as a land that was focused west, or as a country that was really interested in becoming a global power. And plus, this was a time when, this was an one of the starts of globalization as we know it, modern globalization. And these, but also these clipper ships, they really were kind of form follows function, as Louis Sullivan, the architect, said. They are extraordinarily elegant, beautiful vessels. But the contradiction is that they are not built for elegance or beauty. They are pure, raw capitalist machines. There is not an ounce of superfluous, luxury or fat on them. They are built to make money. So there's a very strange confluence between beauty and profit that I find very unusual. These are, when we think of utility and profit, we think of big box stores or stuff like that. This is a very rare instance.
And what about on board the ship? Was there much opportunity for upward mobility? For example, could a crew person work their way up to a captain in the course of their career?
It's a very good question. Usually the typical able-bodied seaman could not. To start as an officer, you have to start as a sort of a ship's sort of a young assistant. And a lot of these guys came from seafaring families, and they sort of had connections and were able to, I don't know of too many cases where a young seaman who just signed on would eventually rise to being captain. There were some cases of captains who came in who started off as, basically they started off as officers and ended up as captains. And I think there was a Captain Howland who was known as the Kid Glove Captain, because he was basically appointed to be captain because of his family connections. Not that he was a bad captain, but some of the officers and the crew really resented him. They said he's like, he thought he was very haughty, even though they said he was a good, I think Captain Charles Porter Lowe said of him, a very good navigator, but not much of a sailor. And often these captains would be part owners of these ships that have like a 1/32 ownership stake in the ship. So that gave them, a share of the profits and gave them a stake in the operation of the vessel. So I think they often had to be, it was very hard to be an ordinary seaman. You had to have some sort of family connection to have that level of trust. It's not meritocratic, sadly, but that's how it worked.
Right. So Charles Lowe, for example, when he started, he didn't enter just at the lowest rung of the totem pole because of his family connections, correct?
He started off as basically a ship's boy or a ship's assistant, but I think they kind of knew that he was sort of bound for, bound for a higher strata.
Yes.
And Captain Robert Waterman, who was the notorious captain of the Sea Witch and the Challenge, I mean, he started off as a ship's boy, but he came from this very well-connected. His dad was a whaling captain. I think it helped if your daddy was a captain. That was kind of if your dad was a captain, or less likely if your dad was a partner in the firm, that would help. Although Charles Lowe is kind of an outlier because he ended up being, much to his wife's lament and his own lament, part of the poor branch of the family. He said, his wife threw up her hands by the 1870s when the clipper ship era was dying, and she was like, unlike your brothers, we're always going to be poor because we're always going to have to go to sea.
Okay, now we're looking for some statistics. How many miles a day did the record-setting New York to San Francisco voyage, I believe that was the Flying Cloud. So how many miles a day was that ship traveling?
I don't have the number exactly off the top of my head, but I think she made well over 200 miles in a single day, 200 nautical miles, which is pretty fast. I think she, made around 14, 15 knots, for a spell, which is pretty good for a sailing ship.
Okay, we just have a few more questions. Could you discuss the role of Joshua Bates and Baring Brothers Bank in financing the shipbuilding and their commercial trading activities with China?
Oh, that's a very good question. These guys that spent their time as partners in Russell and Company, they developed these connections with Baring's Bank, and they would eventually use. I believe Joshua Bates was an American partner. The link between Baring Brothers and Russell and Company and the Forbes was very, 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 very tight. These were sort of fraternal relationships forged in the factories in China, and Joshua Bates was an American-born partner at Barings and Brothers. What was the gentleman's name? The gentleman's name escapes me. Russell Sturgis was Warren Delano's first boss. He became the first American-born partner of Baring Brothers. And these gentlemen basically funneled money into the ventures of the Forbeses, sailing ships, and also railroads as well. I mean, you had two sort of main sources of capital, outside capital coming into America in the mid-19th century. One was Baring Brothers, the other was Rothschilds. So basically, the Forbeses and the former Russell partners of American firms had a connection with Barings. It's proved to be tremendously useful when they needed capital for shipbuilding and other projects. But then by the 1860s, the Rothschilds Bank also became especially their London branch, became an additional source of capital for investments in railroads. So no wonder that August Belmont, who was the agent of the Rothschilds for a while, became a very, very popular man in New York. So much so that he had changed his name from the German Jewish August Schoenberg to the anglicized August Belmont, and basically kind of betrayed the Rothschilds and started August Belmont and Company as his own bank, using those connections.
Wow, okay, thank you. I think now I was going to share my own screen. So is it okay if we say goodbye to the young sailors?
Of course, of course.
Okay. So I just wanted to thank you so much, Steve. First of all, this was an incredible evening where we learned so much from you. And if people are still reading Barons of the Sea or haven't yet started it, I strongly encourage you to, these characters just leap off the page. The ships are their own characters. There's so much to learn. The time that he covers is broad. You go on global travels. So it's really a wonderful read. So thank you for reviewing the story with us and answering these questions. Coming up next week, I hope some of you might join us for a U.S. History Trivia Night. We're having our partners at Learning Plunge run the event. The categories include political scandals, who's the president, date duel, summer vacation, and know your notables. You can enter for $15 a person or team, and those funds do go directly to the museum. There is the registration website. And other ways you can support the museum is, and I encourage you to check out our website, forbeshousemuseum.org. We'd love for you to become a member. We are always welcoming donations, and we have a newsletter that goes out on a monthly basis. I'd love for you to sign up for that just to stay on top of other great events like this. I'm sharing some pictures from our collection. That's a young Robert Bennett Forbes when he was known as Black Ben because of his dash of curly hair, and his wife Rose. And there's Steven Ujifusa's address. And I'm sure he would welcome communications from all of you. And I know he's working on his next book, so we are eagerly looking forward to that. And that's it from me in the Forbes house. So thank you so much for joining us. And I hope all of you have a wonderful evening. And thank you again, Steve. This was really wonderful.
Thank you all to all of you. Thank you so much, Heidi and Jeff. And really, it's wonderful to speak to you, and stay safe.
Sounds good. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.